Hi, thanks for joining my video. Today I will be discussing 1984. The reason I wanted to start with 1984 isn't because I think it's simply a political book. That's what actually surprised me most while reading it. I expected a story about dictatorship, but what I found instead was a story about the human mind. It's a novel about memory, language, fear, and identity. I found myself asking one question over and over again. What happens if someone can convince you that your own memories are wrong? If you can't trust your own mind anymore, then what exactly is freedom? And that question, those ideas stuck with me for a while, and I must admit I had to kind of pause with reading 1984 just because it was a bit stressful to read. One of the ideas I couldn't stop thinking about was language. Orwell introduces Newspeak, which is essentially a language designed to make certain thoughts impossible to express. At first I thought that sounded absurd, but then I started to wonder how much of our own thinking depends on the words we actually have. If we reduce language into slogans, short captions, and simplified labels, do we slowly lose the ability to think in more complicated ways? What struck me wasn't simply that Orwell imagined a society under constant surveillance, it was that he imagined a society where people slowly lose the ability to trust themselves. And I think that is the most powerful thing that you can do to an individual's mind. To me, that's what makes this book timeless. So today I wanted to share a few ideas that stayed with me after reading it. One thing I couldn't stop thinking about was memory. Throughout the novel, the party constantly rewrites the past. Newspapers are changed, records disappear, and yesterday's truth becomes today's lie. At first, this seems like a way to control history, but I think Orwell was pointing toward something deeper. Memory is how we understand ourselves. If someone could convince you that your childhood never happened the way you remembered it, or even that the events unfolded were completely different, eventually you wouldn't just question history, you would question yourself. I think that's what makes Winston's diary so important. Writing becomes an act of remembering, and remembering becomes an act of resistance, which naturally led me to another idea in this book. The idea of Newspeak also fascinated me a lot because Orwell imagines a language that becomes much smaller every year. The goal isn't just to change vocabulary, it's to make certain thoughts impossible to have, and that made me wonder how much of our own thinking depends on language. So basically, this book has just given me more and more questions and no answers whatsoever. Another idea that stuck with me is fear. In 1984, fear isn't only punishment, it's a way of reshaping people from the inside. Eventually, people don't need someone standing over them. They begin monitoring themselves, which to me is already the beginning of an end. It also made me realize that maybe the most effective prison isn't necessarily walls, but fear itself. Fear changes how we speak. It also changes what we create. It changes what questions we're willing to ask. This combined with Newspeak, I feel, is a perfect combination for creating a perfectly controlled individual, a controlled individual who can eventually create more individuals that will no longer even need to question or rebel. They will just give in to what they are told because they've never had to exercise this ability of just being curious. And as someone who paints, this book reminds me of why art has always mattered. Because art asks questions, it preserves memory, it allows different interpretations, and it reminds us that reality is richer than a single narrative. One answer simply cannot be enough. And I think that that is where the true fear comes from, is not knowing what an answer is and wanting to accept the first thing that you are told. And that is the first way into control, in my opinion. That's why I think artists have always been important, not because they provide answers, but because they keep curiosity alive. And curiosity is difficult to control. And maybe that's why books like 1984 continue to survive, because it not only raises political questions, it raises questions on curiosity, critical thinking, freedom. And the one thing that I appreciated about 1984 is that I don't think that it tells us exactly what to think. It more so asks us to notice that this exists, that this is always going to continue to exist. Whether this generation or future generations, we will all have to eventually deal and come at a crossroads between wanting to give in to what society has created for us, or wanting to question and rebel and think beyond the bubble that we've been born into, whether that be the digital world, whether that be war, that could mean anything. I think the most important thing that I got out of this book is to continue to be curious and to continue to ask questions, even if they are uncomfortable questions, because the moment that you stop asking questions is the moment where you decide to have those questions already answered for you. And when you are no longer exercising those thoughts, I believe that you are creating a new generation that will not even be able to have the choice of exercising those thoughts. I also think that Orwell wants us to notice language, to notice fear, to notice memory, to notice the changes in how we speak, and to notice how easily truth can become blurred if we stop paying attention. I don't think that Orwell wanted us to spend our time looking for Big Brother. I think he wanted us to become more conscious of just ourselves. And I think that this story will continue to live on because it is very symbolic, psychologically, individualistically, and politically. I find myself wondering if our minds are more and more controlled generation after generation, would we lose that ability naturally, biologically, in the future if we are not exercising it now? Just as we do physically, do we lose those abilities when it's no longer exercised in future generations? And so I end this video today with not necessarily giving you answers, but to just question, to simply exercise your ability to be curious and to question everything that you are absorbing, especially now in the digital age. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that you stay curious.